Hello, and welcome to the Humanistic Counseling, a podcast in which we discuss, analyze, critique, and celebrate both well-established and cutting-edge ideas across the field of humanistic counseling. I'm Brett Wilkinson, Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, otherwise known as JHC. Today we have with us a very special guest. I'd like to welcome Dr. Matthew Lemberger Truelove, Professor of Counselor Education at the University of North Texas, as well as Associate Director of the Ronald H. Fredrickson Center for School Counseling Outcome Research and Evaluation at the University of Massachusetts. He is the current editor for the American Counseling Association's flagship Journal of Counseling and Development, a former editor of the Journal of Humanistic Counseling, and former president of the Association for Humanistic Counseling. Today, Dr. Lemberger Truelove will be discussing his recently published JHC article from our April 2024 issue entitled The Social Self in Humanistic Counseling, a Dialogic Alternative for the Practice of Wellness and Social Justice. Dr. Lemberger Truelove, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks a lot for inviting me to have this conversation with you, Brett.
Okay, so in the April 2024 JHC article, you and your co-authors provide a thoughtful critique of classical humanism, and then you suggest it is time to shift to a dialogical humanism. You suggest that classical humanism and dialogical humanism diverge in their assumptions about the self, and that this has important implications for counseling in the modern world. Before we explore dialogical humanism, can you walk us through your conception of classical humanism and the idea that it assumes a stable and authentic self? I mean, what does that mean?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Thanks for asking. So I actually want to partition this off in a few ways. And we briefly discussed this in the article, but we didn't give it as much traction just because it really wasn't the primary thesis. But humanism has a history that precedes humanistic counseling, and yet we tend to conflate humanistic philosophy, humanistic psychology, and then humanistic counseling. And in many ways, this is perfectly fine because they're good fellows, they're philosophically compatible, and there's this clear lineage over time. And yet we put forth this idea that that history will forever endure. I mean, that's something that cannot change, and yet it's not necessary that they have to remain as such in a contemporary form. And so what I mean by that is, if you think back about classical humanistic philosophy, it emerged out of the Renaissance period. And it's essentially this idea that there are human problems that are deeply situated in human existence, which have to do with, kind of the finiteness of the self, how we intellectualize things, how we experience things in groups, and then how we have our wits to figure things out. And this, kind of precipitated a number of really influential and incredible movements in history and across various disciplines, not limited to medicine, psychology, education, so on and so forth. And so, very much honoring that tradition, and moved forward, marched through the annals of time. And then in the early parts of the last century, there were a number of psychologists and other thought leaders in philosophy who loosely cobbled together what is now known as humanistic psychology. In humanistic psychology, there's a series of really kind of influential pieces that we're not really going to have time to get into, but essentially posited the ideas that human beings have autonomy. They have a sense of responsibility to act on that autonomy. They are in a social world, and yet ultimately it is their volition, it's their volitional capacity to act on that social world, as opposed to the inverse, or what was also prominent at the time, the classical psychoanalytic approach that was, these impulses are driving you forward in a very reductionistic way. In a similar way with behaviorism, there was stimulus response that was pushing you from behind. And humanism was this idea, and I actually realized now I left out one of the major tenets, and that we looked at the person holistically. And so it's a very kind of laudable way of looking at a person. And so coming from that epistemological base, then a number of those psychologists became psychotherapists, right? And adopted this ideology and said, there's things about these assumptions of what it means to be a human that we can bring to praxis, that we can use for the purposes of psychotherapeutic reasons. And classically, those were originally the person-centered approach, the existential, various forms of existential approaches and Gestalt, and then later throughout the middle of the last century on through our current times, there's a number of others that have been affiliated with that to varying degrees of agreement and disagreements. For example, constructivism and some other newfangled approaches, right, that are affiliate to classical humanistic psychology. And so, related to and somewhat separate to this is this idea of humanistic counseling, which also had a history at about that same time period. So, like the Association for Humanistic Counseling was originally one of the three founding organizations of the American Counseling Association, came together, and then in the middle of the century converged together to a single organization that we now know. But Humanism and the Humanistic Association continue to endure, just not as one of the larger umbrella organizations, but as an affiliate to the American Counseling Association. And so humanistic counseling was essentially this idea that through high quality relationships, through a certain tactfulness, that if a client experiences this, that this level of support will help ameliorate internal conditions so that they can respond to a challenging world. And one of the pieces that's deeply influential on me is Jane Mayer's 1992 piece, where she basically demarcated, like here's the foundational assumptions, like here are the axioms that make counseling different than other forms of psychotherapy, and that was prevention, development, wellness. And then later, I think she would have been in agreement with this. Other authors added a fourth leg, and that was social justice.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we now know of is counseling, by virtue of the American Counseling Association, really kind of has this basis in humanistic counseling, right? This assumption that if we help create the prior conditions of experience, generally our clients can endure really difficult situations, and that starts to harken back to this idea that we see in humanistic psychology, that we are responsible, that if we have the right mechanisms in our lives, that we can be responsible to be the authors of our existence, and hopefully an existence that's on balance relatively well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and so as you look at that, you did emphasize the social justice aspect, and that's a central part of your article. There are almost two major parts. One's about the social justice and how that dovetails with the idea of a social self. So you frame dialogical humanism as emphasizing social self in a way that you believe fits better for modern counseling than the classical approach. Can you tell us a bit more about dialogical humanism and how it connects with and diverges from the classical form?
Yeah. In many ways, there's an accidental tension that occurs in humanistic counseling, right? Because there's this basic presupposition that you have the wherewithal to act on your world. It kind of smuggles in this idea that everyone's world is similar, right? That if we just do enough, you can kind of pull yourself up from your proverbial bootstraps. And yet, when we look at the clients, particularly the most disaffected groups of clients, that's clearly not the case. And so I like to do some thought experiments with my students where, think about your thoughts before you think them. And it's a clear paradox, right? But our intuitions tell us, I'm thinking all the time. I'm making first person decisions in this moment. But when you think about it, whether it's from a physics perspective, from a biological perspective, the neurobiological perspective, are we authoring those thoughts as an a priori, or are we instead observing them after things have already occurred? So, like even for example, this conversation that you and I are having, or the people who are listening to this podcast, you feel like, oh, I'm making this decision to listen to it, but those antecedents set that thought off before it actually occurred. And that's not to say that we're completely emptied as a self, but this idea that we are authoring experience in this first person manner, while incredibly laudable, can be incredibly problematic, again, when we start thinking about the most disaffected and disenfranchised groups of individuals.
Right.
It creates this kind of erroneous inference that they chose those prior conditions. And in fact, many of these things not just predated that first person experience, it predated their lives and their ability to make decisions on those things.
Mm-hmm. So this goes back to the question of the limits of responsibility in a dynamic interpersonal sphere.
Yeah, yeah, no. And again, this is not to reduce the agency or capacity of the individual, because certainly, good counseling, that's should be our Archimedean point. Like that's our North Star.
Mhm.
But in a way that kind of divorces it from the ecology that's present for our clients' lives seems to be not only naive, but it could be potentially harmful for many
Mhm.
clients. And so, like for example, we think of the concept of like accurate empathy, right? And so one of the implications of a dialogical alternative to humanism, and I adopt this from another, kind of really prominent figure in our circle, the AHC circle, James Hansen, talked about this, that, whereas it seems like an intersubjective process, it's actually a harbinger of modernity, where, one individual can in some way transcend the syllabic, kind of like, how do I get out of my own head and into this other person's head? But it also infers that there is something to be accurate about, right? That
Okay.
there's this kind of stability of experience. And that doesn't seem to be the case for clients or just humans in general, right? Whether it's by virtue of our memories or experience, like socially distributed experiences. Experience tends to change as time marches on. And it's hard to accept oneself if one is always uh, deeply tethered to the certainty or the fixedness of one social truth. And so the idea of a dialogical alternative was to create more flexibility so that it could be inclusive to diverse cultural groups, but that also, how do we reconcile with this inequity so that these prior, with much of the literature has talked about, like these social determinants of mental health,
Right.
how do we make it so that we can actually act upon them in a more opposite manner, without, again, condemning the individual to it's your responsibility. And as a field, we've kind of skirted over the issue. Hopefully, I'm citing the right article. I think we actually mentioned this in the humanistic piece. Uh, um, there was a time when I first matriculated as a master's student. Um, we called mental health counseling called it mental health counseling and community counseling. And about a decade later, we made a switch, and we switched to clinical mental health counseling.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the basic mechanisms or operations of counseling, you have assessment, which leads to, in many cases, diagnoses, and that diagnosis leads to treatment planning, and that leads to intervention, and then, hopefully discharge and evaluation of the client. When you think about it from a community lens, who's responsible? You know, we are assessing the fitness of the client's experience relative to their community. If it's a diagnosis, it's in relationship to how we are as a communal being. The intervention should in some way be germane to to the client's lived experience, and then evaluation. What are the assumptions from clinical? The assumptions from clinical is that we suspend all the community, we suspend all the contaminants, and then who becomes responsible? And so we've kind of created this, you know, inaccurate or potentially deleterious equation for clinicians and clients,
Mm-hmm.
where we say it's a wellness profession, we say it's, influenced by the humanistic tradition, which therefore should be holistic. But we've also said, well, we're bracketing out those things. It's just you. And so in that particular article, the idea is, how do we get the individual back so that we are utilizing the great virtues of humanism that is still retained? All those intuitions of humanistic psychologists, they may or may not have been true. But what we do know is true is that people heal through relationships. So how can we take the beauty of a healing relationship without the mental health uh, culture influences that maybe are less harmful?
Mm-hmm.
You know, placing too much priority on the individual, placing too much priority on, um, how they can be distinct from and transcendent of their circumstances, rather than how do we have intervention approaches that is most relevant to the ecology and cultures of their lives.
So you articulate this, and this is for the listeners, a position paper in the April 2024 article. You have this contrast between the classical and the dialogical humanism, and I want to note that you've also discussed the idea of dialogical humanism at length elsewhere, so listeners can find those references in your April 2024 article. But what about some of the implications here? What do you see as some of the larger implications if perhaps we were to move en masse as a field in counselor education supervision towards a dialogical humanism in training and practice?
Yeah. I'm going to actually throw out the caveat first, is that I recognize how difficult this is, right? In part because the remedy that I suggest, and this could be a function of my limited vision and creativity, but it's really getting back to that preventative developmental focus in counseling. And that how do we create the prior conditions? And I think by doing so, then it actually gets social justice back into the game rather than just a mere talking point or virtue signaling the importance of it as a profession. Because right now, and this is where the challenge becomes really pertinent, is counselors, in the end, it is a profession, right? It's a deeply compassionate and in many ways selfless profession, right? But in the end, it is that fiduciary relationship that a client and a counselor has. Will be present, and so I think the challenge or the potential benefit of a dialogical approach is that it encourages the field to look towards how does social justice not just be a value system, but how can it be something that we actualize. And so again, that's kind of a highfalutin idea, but I think one of which is that how do we mimic? We have to question why is it that we mimic mental health culture and the medical way of working with clients. Again, this is not to ostracize any particular form of counseling. We need all of them. We need a profound diversity, but almost all of the students that I've interacted with for nearly 30 years in this field, the primary aspiration looks very much like a medical professional's office, right?
Mm-hmm.
You got the couch, you got the person doing the billing and those types of things, as opposed to someone who's embedded in the communities, right? There where the clients are at,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's, in their place of employment, whether it's in community centers. And so I think in this way, doing genuine prevention work, again, how do we help cultivate capacities? How do we help to try to ameliorate whenever there are social inequities as a prior condition for our clients, so that when they are thrust into that thinking about your thoughts before you think them, they're best prepared for the response, rather than putting them in this kind of unyielding and really dubious circumstance of how do you choose when it's terrible choices, right? And so I think that's the first thing is to rethink and maybe even expand how we look at the actual industry of counseling. And again, I recognize that there's a challenge, but I also do think that we as a field are in the midst of various challenges, and I actually think that this could be a possible way to improve the types of services that are being offered out there, but then also make counselors themselves feel more sense of value in the work that they do.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to thank you for posing the challenge in JHC in the first place. I think this is one that resonates with a lot of readers and certainly dovetails with certain aspects of my own perceptions, and something that I hope that we can reckon with as a professional and scholarly community a bit more going forward.
Thanks a lot, Brett. I really appreciate it. And yeah, and if nothing else, the real intention of this was not to be the final statement or to offer any truth proclamation. That'd be kind of paradoxical to the intent and to dialogical humanism, but instead to engage a conversation with folks like yourself and others.
Well, and last but not least here, what do you think is important about humanistic counseling, just in general?
Yeah, no, it's a great way to kind of, I wouldn't say end this, but to close this particular conversation. I alluded to it before. I think it's relationships, and not just in a superficial way. We tend to toss that around kind of hyperbolically, but to look at and deeply appreciate what it means to be impacted by others, and how we impact others. And so, earlier when I talked about volition, and there's some questionable things and some of the humanistic psychology in particular. What I don't want anyone to infer is that we are without agency and intention. Like, we have that. It's just probably different than what we think it is. And what it probably is something that's always deeply interconnected with other people. And I think humanistic counseling is the practice of quality relationships.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking with you today. Thank you for joining us here for the Humanistic Counselor.
Thanks a lot, Brett. Greatly appreciate it, and greatly appreciate you.
And many thanks to you, good listeners, for spending time with us here at the Humanistic Counselor podcast. All JHC articles can be accessed through the Wiley Online Library. If you're a member of the Association for Humanistic Counseling, then you get free access to this article and many, many others through the American Counseling Association website at www.counseling.org. If you'd like to become a member of AHC, then we hope you'll visit our website at www.humanisticcounseling.org. Thank you, be well, and hope to see you here next time on the Humanistic Counselor podcast.